our delegation urged for the need for heightened respect for the good offices and fact-finding capabilities of the Secretary General. Today's discussion starkly illustrates why our recommendations need to be adopted. If the past 10 months are any guide, members of this Council will now be subjected to claims and counterclaims about the Sevastopol drone attack. They will not be verifiable, and therefore the chances of Security Council action will be limited, if not impossible. It will also sustain an unfortunate trend of the Council being used primarily as a platform for propaganda, not for deliberation that aids its mandate to protect international peace and security. Resolution 4659 of 1991 recognizes the need for the Security Council to have knowledge of all relevant facts in performing functions relevant to its mandate. It further recognizes the Secretary General's fact-finding capabilities and requires him to monitor the state of international peace and security, making use of the information-gathering capabilities of the Secretariat. We would welcome the Secretary General establishing a fact-finding mission on the drone attack to better inform this Council. One of the reasons for the ongoing food insecurity is the volatility in insurance prices for the shipping of foodstuffs due to the extensive misinformation and disinformation that characterizes this war. It would, at a minimum, a fact-finding mission would, at a minimum, provide more accurate signals to the food and financial markets to threats to shipping of foodstuffs from Ukraine. Finally, Mr. President, we again propose that the conflicting parties and their allies and partners make use of the Secretary General's good offices for the mediation and resolution of the conflict in Ukraine and in stabilizing the wider European security order. We further reaffirm Kenya's commitment to the purposes and principles of the Charter, and as such, our respect for Ukraine's sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for their statement, and now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
President, and I thank Under Secretary General Griffiths and Secretary General Greenspan for their briefings today. The Black Sea Grain Initiative is vital to global food security. The UN estimates that it has indirectly prevented 100 million people from falling into extreme poverty. Over 60% of the wheat exported under the deal has gone to low and middle income countries, including via the World Food Programme to Ethiopia, Yemen, and Afghanistan. Russia's suspension of this initiative over the weekend has meant over 100 ships blocked from seeking permission to enter Ukrainian ports to load grain. An average of 100,000 tons of grain is exported each day under the initiative. This is enough to feed 5 million people for a month. The severe impact, should Russia's suspension of the agreement continue, is clear. Recognising the global food crisis, the UK has not placed sanctions on food or fertiliser exports from Russia to third countries. We have worked hard and continue to do so to ensure there are mitigations in place to avoid indirect impacts of sanctions. And we note that there has been no decrease in Russian grain exports since the start of Russia's war on Ukraine. President, Russia claims it suspended participation in the grain initiative due to an attack on its Black Sea fleet, falsely claiming those vessels were involved in implementation of the deal. As we heard from Under-Secretary General Griffiths, no military vessels or assets are involved in supporting this initiative. And what Russia neglects to mention is that Russia's Black Sea fleet is illegally occupying Ukrainian waters and bombing Ukrainian towns. The global impact of Russia's war on Ukraine has already been profound. Ending the grain initiative would unleash the unprecedented wave of hunger and destitution of which the Secretary-General's Global Crisis Response Group warned in June. We therefore urge Russia to renew its cooperation under the agreement so that shipments of grain can continue as before. We call on Russia to work with all parties to renew the Black Sea Grain Initiative this month. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank both the Under-Secretary General, Mr. Martin Griffiths, and the Secretary General of UNCTAD, Ms. Rebecca Greenspan, for the information that they have shared with us. My country regrets the announcement of the suspension, the announcement by the Russian Federation of the suspension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Such a diplomatic initiative has been fundamental in multiple ways, and I would like to underscore three of these. 1. The signing of the agreement in July this year enabled the resumption of exports of maize, wheat, and other foodstuffs. This contributed to stabilizing prices, as is reported by the FAO's Food Price Index, and as we have just heard once again from the UNCTAD Secretary General. 2. The export of more than 9 million tons of grain and other foodstuffs has helped to mitigate, at least to a certain extent, food insecurity, which is mainly afflicting developing countries, and particularly countries that were already facing very critical levels of food insecurity. 3. The agreement, therefore, represents, as we have stated on numerous occasions, an achievement for mediation and diplomacy. It is a demonstration that constructive dialogue is possible even in times of war. And it is also a sign that the United Nations is valid as it acts in the current time. For these reasons, we echo the call of the Secretary-General to the parties to reactivate the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Likewise, we urge the full implementation of the agreement signed with the Russian Federation. Further, we call on relevant actors to eliminate obstacles to the implementation and the full execution of the agreements. As we have seen, improvements in the availability and access to fertilizers is essential for the agricultural sector and, consequently, for the economy. Crops over the next 2 years depend to a large extent on this. Without the necessary products at the right time, effects on production levels and the increase in global prices will be catastrophic. Without doubt, the highest price of the effects of a suspension of the Black Sea agreements will be paid once again by the most disadvantaged countries, and it will be felt most critically by the poorest populations. Mexico reiterates its full support for the Secretary General's efforts in his liaisons with the parties for the renewal and strengthening of the Black Sea initiatives. And we recognise the role of Turkey in signing the Istanbul agreements. Diplomacy and mediation are the right instruments to achieve a negotiated solution, an urgently needed truce, to bring an end to the war and to the human suffering and the grave economic consequences begotten by it. Thank you, President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Mexico for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Undersecretary General Griffiths and Secretary General Greenspan, for your briefings and so clearly outlining the benefits of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which Russia apparently is ready to deny to vulnerable people in low-income countries around the world. Russia's announcement to suspend its participation in the UN-brokered Black Sea Grain Initiative is deeply concerning and fundamentally irresponsible. We urge Russia to keep this essential life-saving arrangement functioning and allow food exports to move to the world market to reach countries that need it most. As already has been said, at the outset of 2022, conflicts, COVID-19, the effects of the climate crisis had already driven more than 190 million people into acute food insecurity. Since then, President Putin launched his brutal assault against Ukraine. Now, according to the World Food Programme, a further 70 million people may fall into food insecurity. Yet while partners across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe are working together to increase the resilience of global food systems, Russia is once again demonstrating its willingness to weaponize food. Its actions directly impact low and middle-income countries by raising global food prices and exacerbating already dire humanitarian crises and global food security. The United States, along with other Council members, welcomes the UN efforts led by the Secretary General and Turkey to bring this deal to fruition. At a dark time of war, this deal showed the value of diplomacy and the commitment to address a problem with global implications for food security. The Black Sea Grain Initiative has helped stabilize and lower global food prices to pre-war levels. The initiative facilitated the transfer of more than 9 million tons of grain and other food products from Ukraine, enough food to feed tens of millions of people. It has also enabled the World Food Programme to get desperately needed food aid to vulnerable populations. This includes exports of corn and wheat to parts of the world where people need it most. 2/3 of the wheat exported under the initiative have gone to developing countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Any action by Russia to disrupt these critical food exports is essentially a statement that people and families around the world should pay more for food or go hungry and face higher rates of malnutrition and death. We urge the government of Russia to resume its participation in the initiative and extend it in order to ensure that people around the world continue to benefit from it. And we stand ready to support the UN in its efforts to extend and expand this deal. Mr. President, since February, the United States has provided more than $6.1 billion in humanitarian assistance and $2.3 billion in development aid to combat global hunger and strengthen food security. We understand that the Russian government has announced its intention to donate 500,000 metric tons of grain to countries in need. This would be a welcome step, if grossly overdue, but cannot come at the cost of blocking vastly larger quantities of food exports from Ukraine. Our Russian colleagues would have you believe that the United States has not been doing enough to facilitate food exports from Russia. But in fact, the United States has already excluded food and fertilizer from our sanctions on Russia. We will continue to provide guidance as needed to ensure food gets to its proper destination, because we are committed to addressing food insecurity globally. Our Russian colleagues also left out today that there have been 3 Russian attacks on Ukrainian ports of Evgeny and Odessa since the grain deal was signed. One of those attacks took place just a day after it went into effect. Mr. President, let me be perfectly clear. As we have said before, now many times, there is only one way to solve the many food supply chain disruptions this conflict has caused. Russia must end its war and withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement and now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, I thank Under-Secretary General Griffiths and Secretary General Greenspan for their informative briefings. Mr. President, the war in Ukraine is yet another stark reminder of how humanitarian suffering in one part of our globalized world translates into more suffering in other parts. In Ukraine, the approach of winter, attacks on infrastructure, and shifting front lines pose new risks to civilians, where the human toll has already been enormous. Given Ukraine's and Russia's central role in the global food supply chain, local events there often have an immediate short-term effect on commodity prices worldwide, and those short-term price movements affect the long-term food security of people around the world. As we have highlighted before, these effects are particularly devastating on the most vulnerable communities in Africa and the Middle East. In July, the 2 agreements reached sought to address the short and medium-term food security impacts of the crisis. The UAE welcomed the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the MOU between Russia and the UN to facilitate the export of fertilizers, which have undoubtedly helped to alleviate pressure on global food supplies and prices. The attacks over this past weekend on Russian vessels in the Bay of Sevastopol and the suspension of Russia from participation in the initiative have already led to price hikes on the market and can jeopardize grain supply for the most fragile countries. It is important to remember that the Black Sea Grain Initiative does not operate in a vacuum. It is a delicate undertaking that relies on the smooth coordination of a number of direct and indirect stakeholders, from ship owners and operators and insurers. Underlying all this are the assurances by the parties of a safe and secure environment for all vessels engaged in the initiative. It is vital that all parties maintain trust in the mechanism. Changes to any part of this delicate construct, however, will result in ripple effects throughout the entire chain. They affect both food as well as fertilizer exports, and they lead to real-life consequences in places that are most in need of these commodities. With more than 100 vessels registered to be inspected by the JCC, in a moment of persistent global food insecurity, we urge all stakeholders to address their differences, to eliminate the uncertainties and re-engage on this process. We also underline the importance of agreeing to a solution regarding the export of ammonia, a key component of fertilizers, in order to prevent an even more catastrophic global food crisis next year. I also wish to commend the Secretary General and others for their efforts towards achieving these goals. Over the last few months, the UAE has underlined the importance of ensuring that commodities freed for export by the agreements reach those most in need. Thus far, as Martin Griffiths has already outlined, 9.3 million tonnes have been shipped via the JCC established by the Grain Initiative, approximately 3/4 of which was corn or wheat. Beyond easing the strain on food markets, the agreements importantly signalled that positive outcomes were possible with constructive engagement, even while the conflict escalated in rhetoric and on the ground. We commend the significant efforts by all parties that resulted in these agreements, and we reiterate that the full implementation, expansion, and extension of the agreements would have a beneficial impact on global food security. In addition to Ukrainian civilians, the victims of this war have been the women, men, and children of the global south, the ones impacted by the limited access to food, by the high commodity prices, and the refocusing of international attention and resources elsewhere. These latest developments only widen that gap, so we need to redouble our efforts to protect those whose lives have been upended by this war, both in Ukraine and in the rest of the world. As the conflict is extending into its 8th month, we stress once again the importance of de-escalation and finding the right diplomatic off-ramp, and soon. It is vital to identify and build upon areas of convergence, including to address the global impacts of the conflict and work towards bringing a peaceful end to it. For a sustainable peace to be achieved, there is no alternative to a cessation of hostilities throughout Ukraine and to the engagement in good faith of a dialogue to bring about a diplomatic resolution. The UAE is committed to doing whatever it can to facilitate dialogue with key stakeholders to address this urgent matter. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths and Ms. Rebecca Greenspan, the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, for their briefings on the status of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Today's session provides us with an opportunity to assess the benefits and challenges of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, brokered by Turkey and the United Nations, to resume stalled food and fertilizer exports from the Russian Federation and Ukraine to the rest of the world. The Black Sea Grain Initiative is important in addressing global food security challenges and symbolized a major diplomatic breakthrough in the ongoing war on Ukraine. It demonstrated the ability of the warring sides to reach agreement through dialogue and cooperation, at least on humanitarian matters, and gave hope for the future. International response to the signing of the deal in July this year reflected a clear demand for the timely and unobstructed supply of grains from Ukraine to other parts of the world to help address exceptionally high food prices. As we have heard from the briefings, a little more than 9.5 million tons of grain, including corn, wheat, barley, rapeseed, and sunflower seeds, have been exported under the initiative to both upper and lower income countries. We also note that shipments under the United Nations food aid programs to Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, and Yemen have been made possible under the initiative, pushing back the spectacle of hunger for millions of people. It is also evident that global markets had begun to respond positively to the exports, with steady monthly increases in global prices. It is in this context and in the wider interest of all humanity that we urge a reconsideration by the Russian Federation of its decision to suspend its involvement in the initiative. The full commitment of all parties to the implementation of the grain deal is crucial to avoid a reversal of the notable gains and a rebound of food price hikes. We fear worsening times if nothing is done to restore the full operationalization of the initiative, especially as we enter into the winter season. We call on all Council members and the international community to support the intensified engagements of the Secretary General in Turkey in this regard, and urge the parties to work closely and collaboratively in finding a pathway out of the present stalemate. We also call for close cooperation through the Joint Coordination Center on immediate next steps, including the inspection and granting of safe passage to vessels already demarcated in the already demarcated humanitarian corridors of the Black Sea. We call for restraint against unilateral actions that are likely to upend the full resumption of the grain initiative and its possible renewal in November, when it is expected to expire. In keeping with the humanitarian objective, equal efforts must also be made to facilitate the export of Russian fertilizer and other agro-products to critical agrarian-reliant economies. Finally, Mr. President, we call for concerted international efforts and diplomacy towards ending the war. It is in our common interest to support a peaceful settlement of the conflict and to avoid divisive approaches which tend only to aggravate the hostilities and protract the war. We urge the resumption of dialogue towards reaching a comprehensive and mutually acceptable settlement of the conflict. I thank you.
Je remercie la...
I thank the representative of Ghana for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I thank Under-Secretary General Griffith and Secretary General Greenspan for their briefings. The Black Sea Grain Initiative is an important food export arrangement reached through repeated consultations between the UN, Russia, and Ukraine. Since the signing of the agreement nearly 4 months ago, more than 9.5 million tons of Ukrainian food products have been shipped to other parts of the world, and more than 400 ships playing a positive role in curbing the rise of global food prices. As Secretary General Guterres said, this agreement is a beacon on the Black Sea, a ray of hope for millions of people hit by the food crisis. It is not easy to open a food export route in a war zone, which requires the parties concerned to maintain political input, strengthen communication and coordination, strictly implement the provisions of the agreement, and jointly cope with the difficulties and challenges arising in the implementation process. China has noted Russia's recent announcement that it has decided to suspend its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative due to the attacks on the Black Sea Fleet and civilian vessels in Sevastopol. China has also taken note of the response made by Ukraine, the UN, and other relevant parties. We hope that the parties concerned will continue to stay in communication, rebuild mutual trust, and find a solution that meets the concerns of all parties. We also hope that the Secretary General will continue to play an active role in this regard. Russia's grain and fertiliser exports are equally important to the international market, and the memorandum signed between Russia and the UN should be effectively implemented. As Secretary General Guterres has pointed out repeatedly, that this year's food crisis is primarily a distribution crisis caused by high food prices. But if fertilizer exports do not recover in time, next year we shall be facing a supply crisis caused by food shortages, which will be even more severe. Relevant countries must face up to and eliminate the negative impact of all-out and indiscriminate sanctions on normal international trade, take concrete measures to solve the real obstacles to Russia's grain and fertilizer exports, and completely abandon the wrong practice of politicizing and weaponizing economic and trade issues. Mr. President, compounded by conflict and sanctions, the negative spillover effect of the Ukrainian crisis has spread across the globe. Countries around the world have all felt the colossal impact, and vulnerable developing countries are in a particularly difficult situation. A prolonged, expanded, and complicated conflict serves no one's interests. We must work hard to overcome differences, fully pursue cooperation, and make concrete efforts to manage the escalation of the crisis and prevent its spillover effects. Dialogue and negotiation is the only realistic way out of the Ukrainian crisis. Cold War mentality, bloc politics, division and confrontation, isolation and suppression will not bring peace. China has noted that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov publicly stated to the media on October the 30th that he was ready to engage in dialogue with Western countries to ease the current tension. We hope that the relevant parties will respond positively thereto, and all parties will meet each other halfway to open the door to dialogue and negotiation as soon as possible. China has been actively promoting peace talks and will continue to play a constructive role in resolving the Ukrainian crisis and safeguarding world peace and stability. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. And I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Gabon. Dear colleagues, I should like to thank Martin Griffiths, the Under-Secretary General, and Ms Greenspan for their briefings. The signature on the 22nd of July of the Grain Initiative under the auspices of the United Nations and Turkey was a source of hope for the world facing a crisis, economic uncertainty, food shortages, and a real risk of food insecurity for a new number of fragile countries or regions. Even if not everything went to the countries which needed it most, as recalled by Mr. Griffiths. This agreement still gave a positive signal that discussion was still possible in the midst of a deadly war, and that this diplomatic success could have a domino effect, leading to others. This hope and this signal have now been compromised by the suspension and calling into question of the initiative, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and this development has cast shadows on a number of perspectives, notably that of food security for many people who depend on these deliveries. Dear colleagues, the implementation of this agreement requires full and absolute commitment from all parties and the scrupulous respect for the guarantees agreed upon. My country urges the parties to use the same channels which served for the negotiation and conclusion of the agreement to address questions linked to its implementation and to allow for unhindered continuation of exports and the reactivation of the agreement. This agreement has clearly had a beneficial effect on the stabilisation and lowering of food prices if we go by the latest statistics of the FAO. These benefits also apply in regard to an economic upturn resulting from resumed port activity, as a result of resumed maritime transport from Ukrainian ports involved in the initiative, and involving the export of almost 25 million tons of cereals stocked in Ukraine and fertilizers and other foodstuffs under the agreement. The world is facing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis which has been exacerbated this year and run the risks of millions of people falling further and further behind. In this regard, it is the responsibility of all parties to not thwart the process of implementing the Black Sea Initiative. To conclude, my country reiterates its appeal for restraint and de-escalation and asks parties to abstain from any unilateral action which could prove harmful to seeking a diplomatic solution to the crisis in Ukraine. I resume my functions as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Monsieur le Président, I thank USG Griffiths and Ms. Greenspan for their detailed information. During the last 9 months, since Russia decided to go against the stream of reason and against everything we have commonly built together, there has been only one single good news: the Black Sea Grain Initiative. It was welcomed worldwide, and the active role played by the UN and Turkey was duly appreciated. It was rightly seen as a moment of diplomacy, a beacon of hope in an ocean of despair, and experts since then have brought much-needed relief everywhere. The world understood what was standing between them and the food on their table, and it was only the war in Ukraine. Arrangements were needed, and arrangements were made, and they have prevented some 100 million people from falling into food insecurity, hunger, and poverty. Colleagues, as we know, the mechanism has worked seamlessly. It should therefore be maintained and reconducted, and there was and is no reason to suspend it. Russia's decision to suspend it, excluding itself from yet another of its international commitments, throws us back in time, and we do not need reminding its consequences. They are already being felt. As a result, the markets will go nervous and distressed, the prices will spike again, the needy will suffer, and the hungry will have to wait. Suspending the deal is a statement telling the world that while there is plenty of food, while all means and rules are there to make it available, someone has decided to oblige families around the world to pay more for food or risk go hungry. Inflation is already unusually high, and the situation can only get worse, including the winter arriving in many parts of the world. Our question is, on what basis can a few people in Kremlin decide who should eat and who should not, and dictate to developing countries in Africa and Asia, maybe not only, if they can have something on their table, if they can feed their children. The reasons given for suspensions linked to allegations of drone attacks have, as we heard, nothing to do with the shipments. Let's not forget that Russia is illegally occupying Ukrainian waters in the Black Sea, after all. Colleagues, no one has the right to weaponize food. No one has the right to play with hunger, and no one has the right to play starvation games. We call on Russia to reconsider its decision, go back and do its part with inspections, and renew the deal later this month, honoring its commitment and enable food to reach those who need it. It must also do better, end its war of choice and respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Finally, we encourage and fully support the United Nations in its efforts to resolve the situation through talks and dialogue and help avoid a redo of an artificial global food crisis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank USG Martin Griffiths and UNCTAD SG Rebecca Greenspan for their briefings. The Black Sea Grain Initiative was a sign of encouragement in the midst of a tragedy that affects millions in Europe and elsewhere, as well as a demonstration of the potential of dialogue to contain the spillover effects of the conflict. Brazil deeply regrets its suspension. The consequences, we all know, will be dramatic, even more so for developing countries, which will have to face the renewed threat of food insecurity. We recall the Secretary General's warning. The world may be on the threshold of an unprecedented food supply crisis. The interruption of grain shipments across the Black Sea pushes us closer to that scenario. We believe that, at present, simply pointing the finger at others will not bring us closer to a solution. We urge the parties to return to the negotiating table and renew the commitments of last July without delay. It is no exaggeration to say that the lives of millions depend on the grain initiative. Madam President, Brazil understands that the Black Sea Grain Initiative should have been the initial step on the journey towards peace. Unfortunately, it turned out to be an almost isolated effort and not part of a set of actions that would result in building trust and cooperation between the parties. We are aware that the conflict in Ukraine has complex causes which involve the architecture of collective security in Europe. For this reason, it may not be realistic to expect a short-term solution for this crisis. In this context, creative and pragmatic measures, such as the Istanbul agreements and the exchange of prisoners of war, should be encouraged by the international community. We reiterate our willingness to contribute to exploring new paths for dialogue. The price of delaying a diplomatic solution in good faith and without preconditions is simply too high. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President, and I thank the briefers for their candid statements. Again, we are here to discuss consequences of Russia's own illegal war against its neighbor and fellow UN member state, Ukraine. This war is a blatant violation of international law and the very principle of the UN Charter, which we have all committed to uphold. In addition to the enormous and steadily increasing loss of human lives and the grave humanitarian consequences for Ukrainians, this war increases the risk of an imminent global food shortage. The detrimental effects of Russia's illegal war are being felt far beyond Ukraine, with devastating consequences for the millions of people already facing hunger. The negative impact on this war on global food security is clear. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the reason why the supply of Ukrainian grain to global food markets stopped, with undeniable and direct consequences on the global food supply, exacerbating shortages and higher prices. Russia's war of aggression is affecting us all. Grain from Ukraine is also critical for the World Food Programme and other humanitarian actors responding to increasing humanitarian needs across the globe. It is vital that the Black Sea Grain Initiative is fully implemented and continued. We trust that the parties' commitment to the agreement will continue, and we call on Russia to lift its suspension in order to minimize the impact on the population that depend on these shipments. It is essential to keep a transportation line open to secure food for the world's most vulnerable people and countries. President, in July, we were encouraged to see that the parties were able to negotiate this critical agreement to allow for the resumption of exports from the global breadbasket Ukraine and food and fertilizers from Russia. The Security Council called the agreement a beacon of hope and multilateral diplomacy in action, and we are pleased to learn about now the UN's effort for a movement plan to keep vessels moving. Norway continues to support the SG's effort to dialogue and mediation between the parties to further the grain agreement. And when the time comes, we will stand firmly with the UN in the efforts to build and sustain peace, including the full restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized border. President, let me conclude by reiterating that Norway does not and will not recognize any illegal annexation of Ukraine territory. This includes the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. We remain steadfast in our commitment to international law and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. The delegation of Russia has requested the floor once again. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, President. We have a very difficult interpretation of statistics, and I would like to draw attention to the fact that on the website which prepared by our colleagues from the UN, and there is data from the JCC. As of the 29th of October, along the grain corridor in the Black Sea, 409 ships had passed through. From them, more than 40% had went to European countries. The overall export of ton of food was 9.5 million tons, and 43% of that was corn, and wheat was only 29%. Today, reference was made actually only to wheat, and that's only a third of what was exported. We should also bear in mind that almost far from that not all Ukrainian wheat is food grade. Still, more than half of the recipients are in high-income countries, and the vast majority are states in the European Union. In low or even middle-income countries, they receive less than a quarter of exports. Over 3 months, just over 2 million tons. Through the World Food Programme, only 225,500 tons, or 2.3%. We haven't received any confirmation from EU countries that they allegedly are transferring or indeed reselling commercially part of the food that they bought from Ukraine and sending that to poor countries. We are still finding it difficult to understand why the WFP is playing this role, low role. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Russia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Under Secretary General Griffith, UNCTAD Secretary General Greenspan. I also recognize here the representative of terrorist Russia in the Soviet permanent seat. Terror against civilians has become a hallmark of Russia in its war aggression against Ukraine. This morning, Russia has again attacked Ukraine's energy facilities and other critical civilian infrastructure with missiles and drones. In particular, over 50 cruise missiles were launched from the north of the Caspian Sea and from Rostov region of Russia. Most of them were down by the Ukrainian Defense Forces, but the rest targeted 18 critical civilian infrastructure sites, mostly energy facilities in 10 Ukrainian regions. At least 13 people have been wounded as a result of the attack. In particular, Russian strike on the capital city of Kyiv has caused water outages for 80% of the households in the city. About 350,000 households in Kyiv were also cut off from electricity this morning. Russia continues its deliberate attempts to undermine the progress achieved by the mankind since the Second World War. We strive for efficient application of international law. Russia attempts to break its core principles. We contribute to strengthening the principle of sovereign equality of nations. Russia claims for its exclusive rights to dictate other nations its will. We do our best to resolve the global food crisis. Russia deliberately dooms millions throughout the world to hunger. Madam President, we are outraged but not surprised over the announcement by Russia to suspend its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This announcement did not come all of a sudden, as Russia has never given up aggravating the food crisis as a tool to pressure and blackmail the world. Earlier, we have already heard Russian threats to quit the initiative. Since September, Russia has resorted to impeding the passage of ships through the grain export corridor, which led to its effective blockade. According to the Ministry of Infrastructure of Ukraine, as of 30th of October, 218 cargo ships have been at a standstill in the corridor, with some of them waiting there for more than 3 weeks. Of these number, 95 ships with grain have already left the Ukrainian ports and are now awaiting inspection to depart to their final destination. 101 are awaiting inspection to arrive in the Ukrainian ports, and remaining 22 ships are waiting to leave the Ukrainian ports. This is an absolutely deliberate blockade by Russia, started more than a month ago. Their intention is crystal clear: to make Ukraine succumb to Kremlin's demands by blackmailing to bring back the threat of large-scale famine across the globe. Distinguished colleagues, crocodile tears of Putin's representative do not cover up the cynicism of his masters and their total disregard towards the critical nutrition needs of millions of people in the different parts of the world. Literally, more than 2 million tons of foodstuffs are now on board of those ships that have been blocked by Russia in the grain corridor. Blocking such an amount means that access to food has been worsened for at least 7 million consumers throughout the world. It is disgusting that while depriving people in need of 2 million tons that could be supplied immediately, Russia generously promises to send 500,000 tons of grain in the course of the next 4 months, while extensively stealing grain from the occupied part of Ukraine. Russia has forgotten to explain the reasons for such generosity. The hunger threat stemming from the Russian actions becomes even more obvious if one takes into account the general amount of food supplies since the first ship left the Ukrainian port of Odessa on the 1st of August this year. Over the 3 months, we have managed to export more than 9 million tons of foodstuffs under the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and 5 million tons out of this amount were sent to the countries of Africa and Asia. We are particularly concerned over the detrimental impact of Russian actions for the grain supplies under the UN World Food Programme for the countries teetering on the edge of famine. Over the period of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the UN contracted grain for Ethiopia, Yemen, and Afghanistan, almost 2,000 tons from Ukraine. We have also allocated 50,000 tons of grain as humanitarian aid for Ethiopia and Somalia, and these supplies are also under threat so far. Madam President, Ukraine, in its turn, as a reliable contributor to the global food security, remains committed to good faith implementation of its obligations under the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Our commitment has not been shaken by Russian deliberate and regular armed attacks and provocations. Let me remind you that on the 23rd July, the next day after the grain initiative had been signed, Russia shelled the port of Odessa with missiles. On the 23rd of September, the port of Odessa sustained another Russian attack with UAVs of Iranian origin. It is one of those ports Russia has committed not to attack according to the grain initiative. Ukraine has done its utmost to ensure functioning of the grain corridor against backdrop of recent terrorist attacks by Russia against our critical energy infrastructure that in particular cut off the Ukrainian ports. We remain ready to continue gathering and shipping agricultural products to ensure global food security. The only thing that Russia is able to feed us with is its fakes and disinformation. It is a matter of particular concern that the Security Council has also been misused by Russia to promote its false narratives. The last week in the Council was exemplary in this regard. Today we have again faced Russian attempts to discredit the Council by turning it into a venue for circulating new portion of lie. The lie that served the same goal to cover up its aggression against Ukraine, its war crimes and crimes against humanity, as well as its actions aimed at aggravating food crisis worldwide. This practice is discrediting the Council, and it must be stopped. Madam President, we welcome that the Secretary General continues to engage in intense contacts aiming at the end of the Russian suspension of its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We commend the role of Secretary General in brokering and implementing the initiative and support his efforts to secure the agreement. A strong response by the UN and Turkey as signatories of the agreement with Russia is needed to bring to an end Moscow's attempts to terrorize the world with the threat of hunger, genocide, and to make it fully implement its commitments under the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Representatives of the UN and Turkey are negotiating with the Russian delegation and continue to look for solutions for the full implementation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. According to the proposal of the Joint Coordination Center, representatives of the UN and Turkey envisage the work of 10 inspection groups to check 40 ships. Such a proposal was accepted by the representatives of Ukraine. Representatives of the Russian Federation were informed. Thus, 12 ships with 354,500 tons of agricultural products left Odessa, Chernomorsk, and Pivdenny seaports today for the needs of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Among them is the bulk carrier Ikaria Angel with Ukrainian wheat intended for the residents of Ethiopia, which are on the verge of famine. This is the 7th vessel chartered under the UN World Food Programme. At the same time, the passage of Ukrainian ports for loading is allowed for 4 vessels that passed the JCC inspection the day before with the participation of all parties, including representatives of Ukraine. The Declaration of Leaders Summit on Global Food Security of the 20th September 2022 explicitly named Russia's latest invasion of Ukraine among those factors that have disrupted production and supply chains and dramatically increased global food insecurity, especially for the most vulnerable. I would like, therefore, to reiterate that as soon as Russia is compelled to stop the war, the looming threat of hunger will be over, in particular for the most vulnerable nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Under-Secretary General Griffiths and Secretary General Greenspan for their briefings. Mr. President, the Black Sea Grain Initiative marked a turning point in how we put the needs of those furthest behind first, even at times of war. It is a message to the world that the United Nations, Turkey and parties to the conflict pledged to do the utmost to limit the suffering of those dependent on fertilizer and grain exports for their food security. The Black Sea Grain Initiative has already moved more than 9.5 million metric tons of grain and foodstuff. It brought the global food prices down. As a result of this initiative, the World Food Programme was able to intervene before famine took hold. Children around the world, from Afghanistan to Ethiopia, Somalia to Yemen, have been benefiting from the Black Sea Grain Initiative. These products are still desperately needed today as we head into winter. Furthermore, an increase in food prices globally will threaten those in an already precarious situation as inflation leads to a cost of living crisis worldwide. Mr. President, as of this morning, local time, there were 97 loaded vessels and 15 inbound vessels registered for inspection around Istanbul. The ships anchored outside Bosphorus pose navigation risks. We have been, therefore, implementing a movement plan with the UN for these vessels. Mr. President, the Black Sea Grain Initiative must continue. The trust between nations with different development levels has been hard-earned and can be easily lost unless we take proactive steps today. 2 deals have been brokered, as you know, to bring irreplaceable Ukrainian and Russian products to world food markets. We must find ways to overcome any difficulties that prevent the full implementation of these deals. Today, we call for common sense in recognizing the need for restraint, common sense in upholding our responsibility to protect the most vulnerable populations of the world, who have turned to the United Nations as their last hope. These 2 deals should be tackled on their own merits and be decoupled from the developments on the ground. Both deals were made in good faith and should continue in good faith. As we speak here today, we have been in touch with the parties to ensure the continuation of this initiative. Turkey hopes that reason will prevail and the Black Sea Grain Initiative will remain intact and in place. We also will continue to support all efforts to end the war in Ukraine. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Turkey for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Merci, le Président. Thank you, Mr. President, for allowing us to speak in the Council today on this important topic. I will limit my contribution to 3 points, but before doing so, I would like to thank the 2 briefers, Mrs. Greenspan and Mr. Griffith, for their important insights. First of all, above all, I would like to recall one fundamental fact. The only reason why the traditional grain export routes from Ukraine to the world markets were jeopardized and interrupted is simply because of the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. The Black Sea Grain Initiative reactivated these crucial routes. These routes became once again a lifeline for millions of people across the globe, and this initiative is a remarkable diplomatic achievement made possible by the United Nations and Turkey. Contrary to some false accusations that we have heard, the implementation of this initiative has been successful. More than 9 million tons of grain have already been supplied to the world through this channel alone, a large part of it to developing countries. And this initiative has also succeeded in bringing prices down to their pre-war level of January of this year, as measured by the FAO price index. However, prices are still too high. The international community is working on many fronts to mitigate this food crisis. This is why the G7 foreign ministers will discuss the Russian suspension of the initiative and its potential global implications, in particular food security in the most vulnerable countries, at their meeting in Germany at the end of this week. We will also look into how to best support the efforts of UN OCHA and Turkey in this respect. We are pleased that the African Union Commission and the foreign ministers of Kenya and Ghana will join these discussions. Mr. President, it is encouraging that dozens of ships are currently on their way to bring more wheat from Ukraine to the world. We commend the United Nations, Turkey and Ukraine for having taken a swift decision, making continued grain shipments via the Black Sea possible. We would like to underline our full support for these efforts and call upon all parties involved to do their utmost to contribute to a safe passage for grain shipments to countries in need. What the world now needs is a public commitment of all parties to an extension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative beyond its initial 120 days. I once again thank Secretary General Guterres, as well as OCHA, UNCTAD and WFP for their efforts in this regard. I thank you, Chair.
I thank the representative of Germany for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Romania.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Secretary General Greenspan and Under Secretary Griffith for the briefings. They both confirm what we assessed in Romania, which is a neighboring country of Ukraine and also a Black Sea country. The Black Sea Grain Initiative has proven instrumental in unblocking the grain exports in the Black Sea region and consequently in avoiding a food shortage catastrophe for millions worldwide. It needs to be implemented and extended for the benefit. And making food available and not weaponizing it, it is both a shared and individual responsibility of all member states. Romania condemns Russia's suspension and adds its voice in calling on Russia to revert its decision and to resume the implementation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. As mentioned by previous speakers, the positive effects of the agreement brokered by the UN and Turkey are visible beyond any doubt. Global food prices decreased and grain became available to the least developed countries and to the developing countries. Mr. President, such strong encouragement to stay the course on the Black Sea Grain Initiative comes from a country that is doing already a lot to support export of Ukrainian grain to different parts of the world. Romania has facilitated the export of over 5.8 million tons of grain from Ukraine via Romanian roads, railways and ports. The port of Constanța, which is our largest port in the Black Sea with a capacity to ship over 25 million tons per year, has become a major gateway for Ukrainian grain shipments to the outside world in complementarity with the efforts under BSGI. And in order just to provide the full picture of the magnitude of this effort and also to provide a reality check, I would like to provide the following data. A maritime vessel using the BSGI corridor can carry at least 30,000 tons grain and can be loaded directly from the relevant Ukrainian ports, directly from the silos. In order for the same maritime vessel to be loaded in the Romanian port of Constanța, it needs to wait for the transit of trucks or train or barges on the Danube River towards the port. For all our information, a truck can transport between 22 and 25 tons. A train car could transport 50 tons, and a barge around 2,000 tons. I made the calculation, and I think probably in order to load a 30,000 tons maritime vessel, we would need to use 1,200 trucks. And this has been the reality on the ground for the last more than 8 months since the war broke out. Truck by truck, train by train, ship by ship, towards countries and regions that badly need them. To accelerate this process, we liberalized the bilateral road transport and freight in transit with Ukraine, offering support in Romanian ports to Ukrainian flagships, adapting the wide gauge railway line to ensure connection to the rail freight transport and facilitate access to the Danube River port of Galați. And that's how Romania became an important transit country for Ukrainian grain, and we will continue to extend our support. My country's efforts and EU solidarity lanes are complementary to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. But the initiative brokered in July by the UN Secretary General needs to continue and be extended beyond November 2022 so that even more people can afford bread. We strongly support it. I may also add that in addition to our efforts to support delivery of Ukrainian grain, we continue to make available to many UN member states, as a major grain exporter, significant amounts of Romanian grain. We do play a key role in food security, and we will continue to act responsibly. Food needs to remain available for people in the future. We need to avoid a greater food crisis that would affect vulnerable people in the whole world. Romania stands ready to support the efforts of the UN Secretary General in making a difference in people's life. And I conclude by saying that there is no alternative to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and nothing can meaningfully compensate for its absence. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Romania for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Silvio Gonçato, Chargé d'Affaires ad interim of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, President, and thank you for granting us the opportunity to speak during this important debate. The EU greatly appreciates and supports the work done by USG Griffith and Secretary General Greenspan for the implementation of the UN Black Sea Grain Initiative. And we also commend the role of Turkey as host of the Joint Coordination Center. Mr. President, Russia's intention to suspend its participation in the UN Black Sea Grain Initiative is extremely concerning because it will obstruct the export of much-needed grain to address the global food crisis. Russia is solely responsible for the global food security crisis, which it has caused by its unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine and its blockade of Ukrainian seaports. The UN-brokered agreement has made, together with the EU-Ukraine solidarity lanes, a significant difference by allowing the export of grain and agricultural products from Ukraine to the global markets and to the countries most in need, including the Horn of Africa, Yemen, and Afghanistan. The Black Sea Grain Initiative has brought to the global market over 9.5 million tons of grain and foodstuff, as already underlined by many speakers before me. And in this context, the EU has exported 14 million tons of grain to third countries, which is a level higher than in the past. All these efforts, as underlined by USG Griffith, have contributed to lowering food prices, which is what matters here, to the benefit of developing countries. Let me also reiterate, to reply to my Russian colleague, that most of the wheat goes to the least developed countries, and 90% of it, and developing countries 14% of it. And that, according to UN estimates based on the World Bank model, the reduction of prices for staple foods has indirectly prevented some 100 million people from falling into extreme poverty. Also, in terms of showing how responsible we are as global actor, as major humanitarian donor, we are ensuring that the countries that are most affected by the food crisis have access to the necessary staple and the necessary food and grains. Regarding fertilizers, I would like to remind that they are not subjected to EU sanctions and that any possible indirect effects, as underlined by Secretary General Greenspan, have been addressed both through measures to address overcompliance and also on a case-by-case basis. And we are ready to act on any case which is reported to us. Since the beginning of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, Russia has been weaponizing food and hunger. Russia's deliberate actions, including destroying stocks, disrupting production, and imposing quota restrictions on its own export of foodstuff and fertilizers, have exacerbated the global food security crisis. We therefore urge Russia to reverse its decision and to immediately resume the implementation of the UN Black Sea Grain Initiative, which is key for the livelihood of millions of people. And we strongly support the United Nations Secretary General's call for the extension of this initiative beyond its current period of ending in November. Finally, the EU and its member states remain fully mobilized to address the crisis and will continue to respond to it and support timely and stable delivery of Ukrainian agricultural products to the global markets. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Gonzato for his statement. Dear colleagues, there are no more speakers inscribed on the list of speakers. The session is adjourned. The 9,177th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in Somalia. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Somalia to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration